Essential question 4 is, in what ways did Andrew Jackson embody the contradictions of democratic nationalism? The APUSH test really doesn't ask a lot of specific questions about particular presidents. Instead, they like to focus on social history, major trends, and that type of thing. However, there are a couple of exceptions to this rule, and Jackson is one exception. He is a particular president that you can expect to get some specific questions about and some actual focus on the test on him in particular rather than just his time period. And the reason for that is Jackson is very influential. He changes the way elections occur, he changes campaigning, and he very much changes the nature of American democracy, in particular the image of the presidency and what a president should be, because he will set standards and precedents that later presidents are going to follow all the way up until today. Jackson proves to be a very controversial figure at the time and even today. But we cannot deny that he is very, very influential in American democracy. So we want to really understand him pretty well, understand the events that are happening during his administration, because you can expect to see some pretty specific stuff on Jackson in particular on the APUSH exam at the end of the year. So first, Jackson had a major influence on the party system by introducing what he called rotation in office, but what his opponents called the spoils system. And in this system, Jackson replaces government appointees with his loyal supporters. So people that had supported Jackson in his election find themselves getting high prestigious offices in the federal government as a kind of reward for supporting him during his election. And that's, of course, very controversial to people that do not support him. So as you can see in this political cartoon from the time, Jackson is depicted as the devil, kind of holding rewards and offices on strings in front of supporters who are all jumping at them, sort of like he's tempting them to do the wrong thing. This spoil system is going to be very successful in gaining support for a political candidate and for a political party. And that means that this spoils system is going to be mirrored by local parties, or what we call local party machines at the city and state level, who hand out rewards for votes. The best example of this is going to be Tammany Hall, which was the Democratic Party machine in New York City, and its infamous boss William Tweed, shown here. We'll talk more about him later on, but for now it's important to understand that Boss Tweed, even though he was not an elected official, he was just the head of the Democratic Party in New York City, he effectively ran New York. He effectively ran New York politics because it was Tammany Hall that would hand out government contracts and building contracts and other things like that. Lots and lots of rewards for people supporting the Democratic Party and helping to get their candidates elected to office. It's a very corrupt system, but it was also one that built up a lot of power around these party machines and around these party bosses like Boss Tweed. You don't have to know really any other party bosses or party machines. The only example that you would ever be asked about, and the only example you would ever need if you're talking about it in an essay or a short answer, is going to be Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall in New York City. So we'll talk about them again, but make sure you kind of bank that one in your memory. It's a great piece of ammunition to have for the test. Anyway, in terms of Jackson, he instituted this so-called spoils system. And in fact, he had this even kind of unofficial cabinet or an unofficial group of advisors that were his friends and loyalists, but who were not necessarily appointed officials in the government. And these were jokingly called the kitchen cabinet because allegedly they snuck in and out of the White House through the White House kitchen. But more important than instituting the spoils system was Jackson's role in ending that so-called era of good feelings. The era of good feelings was post-War of 1812, when the Federalist Party had kind of disintegrated, and really there was only the Democratic-Republican Party, so there was broad consensus on the direction of the nation and government policy. But Jackson's really kind of responsible for breaking that party system into two again, with the Democrats, who he will lead, and then the opposition party, which will be called the Whigs. The Democrats believed in laissez-faire economics, and that's the idea that you are hands-off on the economy. The government should not get involved to regulate the economy in any way and to allow it to function as naturally as possible. But that laissez-faire attitude toward the economy tends to result in that cycle of boom and bust that we've talked about earlier in this chapter. But Democrats were also very distrustful of banks and very distrustful of what they felt were Eastern elites, so wealthy bankers and wealthy merchants and industrialists in the Northeast. And as a result, they were opposed to Henry Clay's American system. Democrats pulled most of their support from the South and the West. Remember that in the last election, Jackson won every Southern and every Western state. And generally, Democrats believed that individual morality, like drinking or marriage or what have you, was all a private matter and that the government should not get involved in that. On the other hand, opponents of Jackson split into an opposition party called the Whigs. And again, they formed an opposition to what they saw as quote-unquote King Andrew. And they named themselves actually after a British political party, the Whigs, who had formed an opposition, or whose main policy was opposition to expansion of the monarchy or the monarchy's power. They saw Andrew Jackson as collecting too much power to the presidency, and as a result he was kind of situating himself something like a king. So this is a pretty famous and well-known political cartoon from the time where, of course, Andrew Jackson is depicted as a king. He's holding in one hand the power of the veto because he uses the veto more than any other president combined up until this point as a very powerful tool of helping to influence the way legislation is written. And if you can kind of see under his feet, you've got a constitution that's been torn up. So it's the idea that he's sort of like trampling on American beliefs and American values by situating himself as a kind of monarch. Anyway, Whigs supported Henry Clay's American system. They drew most of their electoral support from the Northeast and the Great Lakes region. And they tended to think that the government actually should promote morals by promoting temperance or public schools or outlawing prostitution, etc. Now, another important element of Andrew Jackson's administration is the so-called nullification crisis. The nullification crisis originated when South Carolina, and really southern states generally, were alarmed by an increase in government power through things like the Missouri crisis or the Marshall Court, etc. And they believed that this expansion of federal power could one day take action against slavery. So you have the origins of nullification in the fear among southern state governments that the federal government was becoming too powerful, and that could mean that they someday challenge the institution of slavery. That fear is exacerbated by the passage of the Tariff of 1828, referred to by Southerners as the Tariff of Abominations. So there was a new tariff that was instituted that raised the prices of foreign imports by raising taxes on them. And Southern states don't like these things because retaliatory tariffs, or tariffs that are placed by other countries on U.S. Imports, tended to strike Southerners harder because they exported an awful lot of cotton, as we've seen before. So in opposition to this tariff of abominations, John C. Calhoun, who had been a senator from South Carolina and in fact who was actually Andrew Jackson's vice president, promoted again that doctrine of nullification in states' rights. The idea that the Constitution somehow allows for states to nullify federal laws that they don't agree with or federal laws that they think are unconstitutional. There's really no good constitutional basis for this, and we've pretty well settled this issue at this point in our history. But at this time, nullification is still a very influential idea that we've seen before and we're going to continue to see here. So John C. Calhoun actually resigns his position as vice president over a disagreement over the Tariff of Abominations with Jackson. In response to further tariffs, South Carolina actually nullifies a tariff in 1832, and this is seen as an almost treasonous act, and Jackson managed to persuade Congress to pass a law called the Force Bill, which authorized Jackson to use military force to collect tariff revenue from South Carolina. In other words, Jackson is saying, South Carolina, you're going to pay these tariff do. You're going to pay the taxes from this like you're required to, and if you don't, we'll send in the military to forcefully collect this. This is really the closest up to this point that sexual tensions have ever gotten us to civil war. Fortunately, Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun worked behind the scenes to work out a compromise tariff in 1833 that allowed the country to avoid violence. But the lesson that Southern states really kind of learned from this is that they can use nullification, the threat of it, in order to get what they want, to get changes made. And it's going to be perceived as a powerful tool for Southern states moving forward. Another element of the Jackson administration, which was a clear contradiction to democracy, was the policy of Indian removal. So during Jackson's administration, and a bit before, many Southern states, as they were expanding westward for cotton cultivation, were forcing Native Americans off of state land. And these Native American tribes had, in most cases, concluded treaties with the national government in order to keep this land. So the act of removing them was actually in violation of national treaties. Nonetheless, Congress in 1830 passed a law called the Indian Removal Act. And the Indian Removal Act of 1830 provided federal funds to remove Native American tribes from southern states. Particularly, they were focusing on the so-called 5 civilized tribes, which were, most importantly, the Cherokee, but also the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole. And this Indian Removal Act of 1830 is very much a repudiation of Thomas Jefferson's assimilationist policy, where he called for Native Americans to assimilate into white society, to adopt white ways and white culture, and they could therefore remain in American territory. But the Indian Removal Act of 1830 is instead a rejection of that idea and says that Native Americans cannot possibly assimilate into white society, and instead they should be removed. They should be forced away beyond the Mississippi River. Interestingly, in response to the Indian Removal Act of 1830, the Cherokee took their removal order to the Supreme Court. And in the Supreme Court case Worcester v. Georgia, which was decided in 1832, the Supreme Court upheld the Cherokees' right to their land, saying that they have concluded a national treaty years ago. They are entitled to this land. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 is thereby unconstitutional. But really importantly, Andrew Jackson, who as head of the executive branch and president is in charge of actually carrying out the Supreme Court's orders, he refused to enforce that decision, supposedly saying Chief Justice John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. And because he refuses to enforce the Supreme Court's decision in Worcester v. Georgia, Indian removal proceeds. And that removal is going to result in the so-called Trail of Tears, where in the process of forcibly removing the Cherokee from their land to Indian territory in Oklahoma, 25% of the Cherokee die on this route, called the Trail of Tears.